Again, thank you very much for coming out. And this is a fundraiser, so you know what that means? We got to open up our wallets and dig out some money and take some raffle tickets and try and get one of them beautiful guns over here. So that's the main thing. That's your job today. Get raffle tickets and try and get one of those guns. And we really appreciate it because it's for a good cause. The Illinois State Rifle Association's the lead in Springfield to protect all of us and our rights. So we all got to remember that when we dig into our wallets. So thank you for that. With that, I want to bring up Dave Smith from Illinois Family Institute, and he's going to say the pledge and the prayer.
We're going to say the prayer and then the pledge. How about that? And if you want to stand, you can. So, all right, would you bow with me? Heavenly Father, Lord, we just want to thank you for this evening and all this group of great individuals that have come out to support the Second Amendment. Lord, we thank you for the gift of self-government. Help us to be good stewards of that gift that you've given us. Pray, Lord, for the protection of our troops. We pray for the protection of Donald Trump and Governor Runner. Lord, give them wisdom and discernment. We pray, Lord, for new, God-fearing, liberty-loving candidates to step forward to run for office. We pray for the people of Illinois to seek out and support candidates who will protect our civil rights, especially the First and Second Amendments. Lord, bless the ISRA, its leadership, and equip it to do its duty and its mission here in Illinois. And bless the food to our bodies, make us healthy and strong to serve you and our calling. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Okay, if you will turn. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. You may be seated. You're going to get up in just a minute. I'm sorry. But I have the privilege of introducing Noel Mayer, who is a freshman at Neuqua Valley High School in Naperville, and the daughter of Chuck Mayer, the majority leader for the Will County Board. She is a member of the Sicilian Singer Choir and the Wildcats, did I say it right? A vocal jazz ensemble. Today is the 203rd anniversary of our national anthem. Will you stand again as she sings the national anthem?
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming
sends chills down my spine. Well, I just want to thank everybody again for coming, because you guys are really so important, because we're trying to raise money, and if you don't come and back this, you know, we don't get anywhere. So thank you so much again. And with that, I want to thank my committee. We met quite a few times to try to make this happen, and I think they all did a fantastic job. Doug Mayhall, Legal Herring, Jim Perry, and Gretchen Fritz, and Vivian Porter isn't here, but she was doing all the website stuff. So thank you very much for all the help that you guys did, and you're probably the main reason this happened. No, and then we decided to sell reserved tables. And the first group that said they want a reserved table is the Will County Board Republican majority right there in the middle. And it made me feel good because my own group supported us. You know, and God bless all the rest of you that got reserved tables and came too, because this is really a great showing. I want to announce, I said endorse. They're already elected, but I want to tell all the elected, say all their names, hold your applause to the end. But now remember their names, because if they're in your district or on the ballot, those are the people that you want to vote for, because you got to realize they're just like us. They're going to defend the Second Amendment at each level of government. So it's real important that we get these people elected. So I'm going to announce their names, and then you can clap for them. Judy Wooten, Judy Ogawa, Darren Deskin, Jim Mustis, Debbie Minatello, Barb Delaney, Gloria Dollinger, Tim Carlitis, Chuck Mayer, Jim Mustis. Again, I wrote it down the second time. It's a long-standing team. I always said Mike Frizzalone was the most important guy in the board, and I forgot that Jim was. Mike Frizzalone, Lisa Bickus, Ben Braun, Jim Dodge, Darren Deskin, Annette Parker, Keith Patkow, Gretchen Fritz, and Don Moran. And if I missed somebody, I'm sorry. I walked around and tried to get everybody I saw. But, Margot McDermott, Madonna, I'm sorry.
You really sorry.
I don't want to mess with that lady. Jack Rickard? Jack Cunningham. I couldn't hear you all the way back there. Jack Cunningham. You should have pointed to him. I know him. But anyway, thank you guys. And remember to really keep in mind when you see these names on the ballot and vote for them. And if you got time, volunteer to help them, because they all need some help. Now I have the privilege to announce a gentleman that I met in, I think it was 2006 or 2007, I can't remember, kind of everything runs together. But before Dan ran for governor, he used to come out to Homer, and Homer's the place, the only place really that he won the whole township. But, so we call it, when he ran for governor, he won in my township. And so we call it his second home. And we've been friends ever since then. We get together every couple of weeks, month and a half, whatever, for lunch and stuff. And we're going to go shooting next time. He's going to try to outshoot me. It's going to be hard. But I just had to give him a couple shots. But he's a real great guy. Besides being a conservative radio announcer, he's a conservative human being. And he has a strong faith, and he has a strong belief in the Constitution. He has a strong belief in the Second Amendment especially. So with that, I want to bring up my Goomba here, Dan Pratt.
Thank you for reminding me about the 2010 election. I appreciate that. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great, really my honor. You know, one of the most successful political movements in the history of America is the gun rights movement, without question. 30 years ago, 0 states had right to carry laws. Today, 50 states have right to carry laws. That is a sea change in a short period of time. And of course, Illinois in particular is a sea change because we were ground zero for the gun banning movement. Municipalities like Orange Grove and other North Shore communities with, of course, Chicago. And the reason that we have seen the sea change over just 3 decades is because of you all. Because the Illinois State Rifle Association, because of the grassroots, because of law-abiding gun owners that stood up for their constitutional right to self-protection, their individual constitutional right to self-protection. That's the difference. And I know, because I've been on a little bit of a whirlwind today. I just came from the Cook County Forest Preserve Foundation golf outing. And you can't see this picture, but I got my picture. Here's me, and here's Tony Preckwinkle, Queen Sugar, right here. And we had a nice little chat, and she actually, like, you can't tell from the picture, but she's actually rubbing the small of my back in this picture. So, I mean, I think she's a little lonely since the divorce. Anyway, you remember, of course, Tony Preckwinkle proposing things like the ammo tax. She's a little happier now because I bought her a Coke, and it's a bunch, and I paid for the tax on it. So anyway, you know, the point is, Preckwinkle, Tiny Dancer, those that want to take away our individual constitutional right to self-protection are still around. They haven't gone anywhere. And that's why Illinois State Rifle Association and gun rights groups and you as individuals and your activism is so important. Because they will never relent. They're just waiting for a time when it is politically advantageous for them to strike again and to curtail your gun rights. And it's really important here, again, because Illinois is the bad example of how you do representative Republican democracy in this country. Illinois State Rifle Association's role and responsibility is that much more important. And the litigation that was pursued by Rich Pearson and Illinois State Rifle Association, in particular against the city of Chicago, obviously was instrumental in freeing hundreds of millions of Americans to protect themselves, particularly those who are unfortunate enough to be relegated to shooting galleries like the west and south sides of Chicago. You are standing up for the rights of the law-abiding in some of the worst neighborhoods of the city, in the state, in the country, and for that you deserve applause. So with that, I'd like to turn the microphone over to the aforesaid President of the Illinois State Rifle Association, Rich Pearson, for a few words before we get to our keynote speaker. Rich.
Thank you. I was not ready, I'm sorry. I'd like to welcome you all. I would like to have the officers and directors of the Illinois State Rifle Association please stand. So if you would do that. Up here on the day, Don Moran is president, Doug Mayhall, first vice president, Jim Perry, treasurer, Lee Groherring, second vice president, and Frank Parada out there, Terry Kreimeier, Al Pescarino, and one of my favorite people in the world, Mr. Jim Minople and his lovely wife, Helen. So, there's Mike. Hi, Mike. They wouldn't let you sit at the table? So, and who's over here? Oh, and John Newman. Okay. So, we have a good turnout tonight. I want to tell you that the fight is not over. It is still in the beginning stages. And what we're seeing a lot of, I'll have to tell you straight away, is a lot of complacency. And complacency is an invitation for defeat. And so we have to stop all that. And we have to really get down, keep people interested, keep people involved, and keep people active. And so I really appreciate this dinner tonight. I appreciate you all coming. And so I will turn this back over to Mr. Ballas, and we'll begin. Thank you so much for coming tonight.
So I have the additional honor of introducing David Keene. A couple months ago, I had the opportunity to sit down with Mr. Keene when he was in town we did on this digital platform that complements the radio program called upstream-ideas.com, Upstream Ideas. We do long-form interviews with opinion leaders and policymakers, so I had a really enjoyable, almost hour-long conversation with David Keene. You can find it at upstream-ideas.com. I'm sure he'll cover a lot of the ground that we covered when we spoke. But you know, for somebody who was the head of the American Conservative Union and then the National Rifle Association inside the belly of the beast, inside the Beltway, for as long as David has been, you can imagine how many colorful stories that he has to share. He's really an engaging, interesting guy who has a keen understanding, no pun intended, of politics. And as Steve mentioned at the outset, and as David Smith mentioned in his prayer, we need to continue to incubate talented people that will run for local and state office in Illinois. There's no question about that. NRA has a good lobbyist here, and Todd Vandermeide, who I've known for almost 2 decades. He does a great job trying to essentially protect our rights by keeping track of legislation and applying the appropriate pressure on the wrong people in Springfield, and there are a lot of wrong people in Springfield. That balance of power needs to change, for what Rich said about being ever vigilant, because there are a lot of Chicagoans in the General Assembly and a lot of gun banners who are Chicagoans in the General Assembly. And again, we don't have the full expression of our rights when you don't have, for example, especially speaking as a Chicago denizen myself, I got to go out to Aurora Sportsman's Club in Waterman to shoot, or Article 2 and these other places in the suburbs. We don't have a gun range in Chicago. I don't think we've had one, so they can correct me, since the Lincoln Park gun club shut down. So that would be a nice change, to establish a bulwark in the city of Chicago for the law-abiding to enjoy shooting sports and also the full expression of their constitutional rights. David Keene is one of the leading intellectuals of the conservative movement. He's one of the leading intellectuals of the gun rights movement for the last half century, not to disclose his age. And he's really somebody that understands the texture of politics and policy and the intersection between the two. It's the reason that we have retired, even though he was turned down, the reason the policies of the hard left, the reason that the #1 gun salesman the NRA's ever had didn't win the day, being former Chicagoan and former President Barack Obama, is because of intellectuals who have been working in the fields for as many generations as David Keene has, fighting the fight regardless of whether the political winds were blowing at our back or in our face. And with that, it's again my honor to introduce David Keene.
I'm gonna put this in here, if it's all right. You know, it really gives me a great deal of pleasure to be with you. When I was asked to come out, I was anxious to do it. I didn't come out, I want you to know, to sell books, though my wife says that's one of my jobs in life, is to sell books. I came out to thank you for what you do, because you're on the front lines here in Illinois, and particularly dealing with the city of Chicago. Illinois has, the politicians here remind me a little bit, if you remember the members of the Japanese Imperial Army who were on these islands and continued to fight when the war was over. This war isn't over, but they have not been told that they're losers, because they are losers, and they're losing in every forum, and they're losing because of people like you here, and just like you everywhere else. You know, I had the honor of heading the NRA during our gunfight, as we call it, with Barack Obama. And at the beginning of that, everybody thought we were going to lose virtually everything. We didn't, because around the country, people just like you did what they had to do to protect their constitutional rights. They stood up, they fought, they made phone calls, they did everything they could do. I remember when New York, which was one of the one-party states that ran through anti-gun legislation that will one day, if things go correctly, be struck down by a new majority on the United States Supreme Court, passed that in the dark of night. I got a call from somebody up there, said that we're going to rally on the Capitol lawn the day after tomorrow, and we'd like you to come up, would you? And I said, of course I would. So this was a rally with 48 hours notice. When I arrived in Albany, it was 30 degrees and it was raining, and there were 12,000 people on the lawn of in front of the state capitol. And one of the veteran political reporters said that it was the biggest outpouring of opposition to something the legislator had done he'd seen in his entire career. The fact is that while there were those who believed and who said and who preached that gun owners really were complacent, as Richard said, and weren't going to fight for their rights. The President of the United States said the NRA didn't count anymore, gun owners were really in agreement with him. They did not reckon with what happened. One of the things we did at the NRA after that, there were a number of things that determined the outcome of that. Partly the administration went after the states, as you know, to introduce packages of gun control legislation that had to be fought at the state level. That ended when the legislative leaders in Colorado were recalled and defeated. And I said at the time that you could hear the speakers of various assemblies across the country, their doors slamming shut because they were no longer even willing to discuss this, because they had learned that gun owners were not asleep, or if they had been, that it was dangerous to wake them up because they were going to fight for their rights. The other thing that took place, and which has been revived thanks to the NRA taking it over, was the Great American Outdoor Show in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is the largest outdoor show in America. And it takes place in Harrisburg, which is a bankrupt city, in February. There is no reason, let me assure you, to be in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania in February, except for the existence of this show. A week or 4 days before that show was to open that year, the organizers announced that none of the firearms that the president didn't like could be displayed, basically the AR and other firearms of that sort. Within 32 hours, 325 of the sponsors walked out. And the interesting, and the show collapsed, costing the city of Harrisburg $70 million. And the interesting thing about it, and this is what had such great political impact, it wasn't widely covered in the media, but politicians watch these things. It wasn't the NRA that walked out first. It was fishermen, and then bow hunters, and then we walked out. And I remember talking to my friend Tommy Milner, the CEO of Cabela's, and he said he was, they're out someplace in Sidney, Nebraska, which I'm not quite sure where that is. But he said his assistant came into his office and said, Mr. Milner, I have to tell you what's happening in Harrisburg. What are we going to do? And Tommy said, pull the plug now. And he said that was the easiest decision he had ever made. A South African outfitter who got 95% of his business each year from that show was one of the first 10 to walk out. And he said it created a financial disaster for him at home because he didn't have the clients that he thought he'd have, but it was worth every penny it cost him. That sent a message that the other goal of the anti-gun movement in that fight, which was to divide gun owners from other outdoorsmen and sportsmen, wasn't going to work. That everybody finally realized they were in the same boat, they had to fight together, they had to stand together, or they would be next. You couldn't divide competitive shooters from hunters, or self-defense advocates from hunters and gun collectors, or from other outdoors people, because they knew that they would be next on the list. And at that point, the attempt to undermine the Second Amendment virtually collapsed on the part of the administration. Of course, we won the final thing in the Senate. One of the other reasons I'm here is that during that period, I didn't get to talk to people like you who were on our side. I remember I was invited up to Harvard, and my friend Tommy Milner, who I mentioned, called me from Cabela's, and he said, I only have one question for you, Dave. And I said, what's that? He said, how come Wayne LaPierre gets to go to the Mule Deer banquet, and you have to go to Harvard? I said, because he had first choice. But it was an interesting time, and it ended the way it did because of you, because of people just like you all over the country. Think back, though. Think that was mentioned earlier. Think back to 1968 in the passage of the Gun Control Act of 1968 during the Johnson administration, the most restrictive anti-firearms legislation ever passed.
If you had asked someone in 1968, actually some of us were here, but if you had asked us, in 2017, will there be a right to carry concealed in every state of the Union? They'd say you were crazy. Because at that point, most people were guessing that we wouldn't have the right to own firearms by 2017. After Lyndon Johnson left office and Richard Nixon came in, his Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, convened a commission which, the findings of which he endorsed, which was that all sidearms should be confiscated within 10 years, that it should be made illegal to possess, sell, or manufacture any handguns in the United States. That was the atmosphere in 1968. Coming up to that year, the NRA wasn't a political organization. We became a political organization because of the demands of our members and because of one congressman, John Dingell, a liberal Democrat from Michigan, who just retired recently, who came to us and said, you know, you can train all the people in safe gun handling that you want. You can have all the ranges that you want. You can run all the competition that you want. You can talk about hunter safety as long as you want, but none of those people are going to have guns unless gun owners stand up for their rights and fight for them. It was after that plea to our board that we formed the Institute for Legislative Action and helped to lead gun owners in the fight that's been ongoing ever since. And the reason that we've made progress is not because we're right, though we are. That makes a little difference in the political wars that we have to fight. It's because there are so many of us. Think back to that period, then think forward to now. You know, in the 1980s, Wayne LaPierre, who's now the executive vice president of the NRA, was our director of state and local activities. And in the early 80s, he called up a woman in Florida, probably one of the most important and influential presidents ever of the NRA, a woman by the name of Marion Hamlin. And he said, Marion, there are only 3 states in this country that have laws that allow citizens under some circumstance to carry a firearm concealed. You need in Florida to develop model legislation and get it through. And it was because of that decision and the fight that took many years that now 14.5 or 15 million Americans across this country have the right to carry a firearm for their self-defense and to carry it concealed legally. That would not have happened if it weren't for people in states like Illinois that fought for it. Illinois, is, in some senses, is one of these one-party states like New York, like Maryland, like California, where the other side still holds sway. But that's why we have courts, and some of the heroes of the battle for gun rights come out of Illinois. Otis McDonald was one of them. Without Otis McDonald as the plaintiff in that case, the Heller decision would not have been extended to the states of this country. So we all owe him, in his memory, the gratitude that he earned and deserved. You know, after that was over, the federal courts don't have the sense of humor that they should have. You know? They ordered Rahm Emanuel in the city of Chicago to pay the NRA $1 million and some change to reimburse us for the legal fees in that case. And I said at the time that if the court had any sense of humor at all, they would have made the man deliver the check personally, rather than in fact deliver it. But, you know, we're not only protecting our rights, and if you look at what politicians talk about today, they talk about, at least on our side, constitutional rights, respect for the Constitution. You don't hear so much of that on the other side. But I remember when, some years ago, when Mitch Daniels, who's now president of Purdue University, but was then governor of Indiana, gave a speech in which he said, you know, if you stop and think about it, the familiarity of millions of Americans with the Constitution and our constitutional rights is directly traceable to the activities of the National Rifle Association, not to the schools, not to all of the people who should be teaching these things, but to the NRA, because for decades, the only group that was talking about these rights was the National Rifle Association. And it extends beyond the Second Amendment. It extends to the entire Constitution. And Mitch's view was that all of us sort of repopularized not just respect for, but an understanding of what the Constitution stands for. So we have a lot to be proud of. We've made a lot of accomplishments, but that word that Richard mentioned earlier, complacency, is something that we always need to be concerned about, because Americans tend to be complacent people. Not every gun owner or hunter is a member of the NRA, as you know. There are 14.5 million concealed carry owners, and we only have 5 million members. There are guns in 43% of the houses in this country, and not all those people are members of the NRA or in Illinois, members of the Illinois Rifle Association. Some years ago, the Gallup people took a poll and asked if you're a member of the NRA. And at that time, we had 4 million dues-paying members, and if you took the figures that the Gallup poll came back with, we had 40 million members. Now, our board suggested to me at the time that it meant that 36 million people were cheating us out of our dues. I suggested that those 36 million people were the reason anybody listened to us at all, because all of us in Illinois, I'm sure that you talk to many people who are sportsmen, hunters, shooters, who identify with and follow the lead of the Illinois Rifle Association, even though they're cheating you out of your dues. The same thing is true with the National Rifle Association and with any group that takes these stands. So we've come a long way. We've got a lot to do. But one thing I will refer in this instance to the book I wrote, because the foreword was written by John Bolton. And this is why, even though those members of the old Japanese Imperial Army are in Springfield fighting to keep the dream alive, facts don't matter much to them. And John, in his foreword, said that the anti-gun movement reminds him in many ways of the unilateral disarmament movement of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where there were actually people who believed that if the United States simply destroyed its weaponry, disarmed itself, got rid of its nuclear weapons, the world would be a peaceful place. That no one from that point on would have any reason to be afraid of anything. Utopia would arrive. Fortunately, we didn't do that. But the anti-gun movement is the same thing. It's a quasi-religion. Empirical facts mean little to these people because they actually believe there are people who exploit it, just as there were communists who exploited the unilateral disarmament movement. But a lot of the people involved are sincere and actually believe that if they could snap their fingers and firearms would disappear, there'd be no more break-ins, there'd be no more robberies, there'd be no more murders, there'd be no more rapes. We live in a peaceful and wonderful society. And people who actually believe that aren't going to give up and don't give up. And when you've got people like Michael Bloomberg supporting them, they're going to have the resources to continue to fight. They've lost, there's nothing hostile to the Second Amendment that's going to pass the Senate and the Congress right now. But think about complacency. If in the next election 3 Senate seats shift to anti-gun people, there will not be another conservative appointed to the United States Supreme Court. And the rights that are guaranteed by Heller and McDonald can be restricted out of existence by a hostile majority on that court. In the next year or so, we expect passage in the Congress of both the legalization of suppressors, which will happen first, and we expect concealed carry reciprocity to pass. Will that happen if those changes take place? It doesn't take much in a country as evenly divided as we are to reverse everything. We've made a great deal of progress because whatever one thinks about Donald Trump, and among conservatives, liberals, Republicans, there are all kinds of feelings about him. On one thing, he has been solid. He promised an appointment to the Supreme Court in the mold of Antonin Scalia, and he delivered it. He promised. He promised to roll back many of the onerous regulations on firearms ownership and on firearms dealers and gunsmiths that were enacted and promulgated during the Obama administration, and he's doing that. He promised greater access to sportsmen to public lands in the West, and his Secretary of the Interior is doing that. They're delivering on those things. But because of the nature of politics in Washington, just as they're undoing it, they can be reimposed by another president, because all of these things have to be essentially put into law that passes the Congress of the United States and is signed by a president before those rights are guaranteed. So we won a very important battle. If we had lost that battle in November of 2016, if we had lost that battle, that could have been the war. Because if Mrs. Clinton had prevailed, if she had been elected to the White House, if that had happened, the Supreme Court would by now be irretrievably lost. Because the changes that she would make would be hostile to all of our interests and they would be locked in. We prevented that, but it was in a sense a defensive victory. We prevented something that could have been awful, but we have yet to win. We've won some battles, but the biggest mistake you can make in politics, like the biggest mistake you can make in warfare, is to mistake a battle for a war. The war in which we're engaged continues every day in many different ways in many parts of the country. Referenda are being put on the ballot. Those referenda, in many cases, would impose unconstitutional, in our view, restrictions on firearms ownership. But in some jurisdictions, with enough money from Mr. Bloomberg and others, those restrictions are passing. Laws are being passed in jurisdictions that we think are unconstitutional. But they're only unconstitutional if, when they reach the United States Supreme Court, there's a majority there that says they're unconstitutional, that interprets the Constitution in the way that we and Justice Scalia and others believe it should be interpreted. And that's not guaranteed unless we get another justice of the United States Supreme Court. When that happens, then these cases will make it up there. I liken our position today legally, in terms of the Second Amendment, to the position that advocates of First Amendment rights occupied in the 1920s. In the 1920s, we all knew that the First Amendment guaranteed freedom of speech and religion and the like, but we didn't know what the parameters were, because the First Amendment and every fundamental right, as the court reiterated in the Heller case, is subject to what are called reasonable restrictions. We didn't know what restrictions were reasonable and what restrictions were not reasonable. That has to be determined in the courts. Since the 1920s, there have been literally dozens of cases on First Amendment rights that have worked their way through the courts to the Supreme Court, and we now pretty much know how government or how the states or the cities or anybody can restrict speech rights. There are limits to where they can, what they can charge as license fees. There are all kinds of limits. Those decisions have not been made with reference to the Second Amendment. And so, some of the things that are passing now, are being imposed now, are the sort of the moral equivalent of a poll tax to keep you from exercising your right to vote, or the requirement of a license fee that's so expensive to speak that you can't speak. At some point, the courts, if they're reasonable, will strike those things down. Right now, that hasn't happened. So that fight on the legal front is going to be ongoing. The whole question of what firearms can be banned by different jurisdictions is unanswered. Actually, in the Heller decision, there was a paragraph which essentially was written, one assumed, because Mr. Scalia, who drafted it, looked at it and said, they tried this once before, let's just say they can't, let's just tell them they can't do it again, because it essentially described the AR-15 as a gun that you couldn't ban. And yet, in 3 circuits, it's now banned. In 2 others, the courts have said that it's inconsistent with the Second Amendment to ban the AR-15. Ultimately, the Supreme Court's got to decide which of those interpretations is correct. And they're going to have to make decisions on a whole series of other things. That's the legal side. But the law is not enough. Before I got up, one of the speakers was talking about the need to recruit more people. Let me tell you a story. When I was president of the NRA, I got a call at 2 o'clock in the morning from this fellow I knew, his wife. And he had been thrown in jail in Queens, in New York, and was being charged with felony possession of a firearm with intent to do harm. He was transiting New York through LaGuardia Airport. He had satisfied all TSA regulations, but they were required, because of an agreement, to notify the port police, who came, apologized to him, and then handcuffed him, because Mayor Bloomberg had given orders that anybody with a firearm in his luggage, or no matter whether it was legal elsewhere, that this was a felony. I finally got hold of a mutual friend of ours who heads the New York equivalent of the Illinois Rifle Association, and said, this is at 3 in the morning, I need a lawyer, a gun lawyer now. He said, well, it's at the office. I said, so get up and drive to the office, and get me the guy's name. And so we got the fellow out, and the lawyer said, he was of course concerned, and the lawyer said, well, don't worry, we can get it pled down to a misdemeanor of disturbing the peace. You'll lose your gun, it'll cost you $10,000, it's a pain, but you won't have a criminal record and all of this. And I said to the lawyer, are you sure? And he said, absolutely. And the reason he was sure, of course, is many of you are familiar with the Firearm Owners Protection Act, which was passed in the 80s to undo some of the things that were done in the 1968 Gun Control Act. The Firearm Owners Protection Act guarantees that you can transit your firearm legally through a hostile jurisdiction without being arrested. But it's been determined that that's an affirmative defense, which means it has to be raised at trial. So what Mr. Bloomberg was doing was arresting people, and I said, how many people have been charged with this felony, and had it dropped down in New York at the various airports in the last year? And he said about 600. Because the mayor knows that none of them could go to trial because the case would be dismissed as soon as they invoked the defense under the Firearm Owners Protection Act. One of our goals this year legislatively is to change that so it specifically says you can, but my point is that rights are dependent not just on the right laws, but on the right politicians. And you could pass all the laws you wanted in New York that would be favorable to our rights, and people like Michael Bloomberg would find some way to harass legitimate gun owners and others that he didn't like, regardless of those laws. So our job is twofold. One is to encourage legal actions to strike down laws that are clearly unconstitutional. And secondly, to elect people to legislatures to enact good laws, and to local and state executive branches that enforce those laws. Because all of that together is what's needed in terms of reform in this country on the question of firearms rights. So our battle is not over. But I am as confident as anyone that regardless of the threats that we face, that gun owners will step up to the plate and do what they need to do to give money to Richard so he can fight at Springfield, to give money to the NRA so we can fight nationally. But more importantly than that money is to step up personally and do the things that they have always done to protect their rights and our rights. That's why we win. Not because not simply because we're right, not simply because we put up that money, but because we put ourselves up. We make our arguments, we make our case, the facts are with us, and we present those cases constantly and as effectively as we can at all levels. We have to keep doing that. We will keep doing it. And the reason I'm here tonight is to thank you for the role that you have played in bringing us to where we are, and to thank you for what you're going to be doing tomorrow and the next day after you register your check to continue that fight. Because if we do that, we will be in a position where, think about it again, in 1968, nobody would have thought we'd have the rights we have today. In 20 years, if we do our job, those rights are going to be expanded. You know that today, there are more, in the area of concealed carry, there are more states that have what they call constitutional carry, which means if you're a legitimate gun owner and pass a background check, you don't need a carry permit. There are more states that have that than have may issue laws like you have here. That's a pretty incredible number when you think about it. And there are only a few states like Illinois, California, New York, and Maryland that are holding out on these things. But the wave, Barack Obama would like to talk about the wave of history. That's not what it is. It's the wave of public opinion that you represent and lead that has led to that situation elsewhere and will ultimately lead to it here in Illinois. So I want to thank you again. I don't want to take up your whole evening because you have other things that you need to do. I don't know if you want me to take any questions or if you want me to shut up and sit down. Yeah, you can do that. tells me wherever I go, I have to sell my book. Now, I don't make much money having it signed, but those who haven't read it say it's pretty good. And once you've paid for the book and read it, I don't really care what you think. But you can, she wanted me to lug them all over here, which I couldn't do because I sold a lot of them yesterday. But we're going to have a book signing in the city tomorrow night. And if you can't get in to buy one of my books there, by golly, you can go to Amazon and buy one there. And it all ends up in the same thing. And there are actually not only some true facts that they say in the book, but the story of the battle with the Obama administration over the Second Amendment, I think is instructive. It is something that's worth looking at, and I tried to chronicle it as best I could. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. The book signing is hosted by me and Mr. Prop tomorrow night at the Skyline Club in downtown Chicago at 5 o'clock. It's kind of an awkward time, but if you want to go to the book signing, yes, when it'll be at the Skyline Club. You have to Google it and you'll see it. With that, I just want to tell everybody again, thank you so much, because this organization can't make without the members. And, you know, while everybody was speaking, I thought of something, and this isn't part of what we were going to say, but I think it's appropriate. You know, Margot does a great job in Springfield. Okay? Real good. Very proud of Margot. But her husband, we usually don't talk about that. But I'm going to say something about that. Every time we have a problem, we need attorney's advice. Who do we go to? We go to Ed. You know, so, and I have a lot of questions. Ed, actually, I tried to make it so everybody could carry that works in the county building. And Ed was the attorney pro bono with Brian Copeland. That's who works with Dick Kavanaugh's office. But how many lawyers, you know, that will help all of us and not charge us, or give us advice and not charge us? And whenever you ask them something, they're there. And I think that's important, you know, when we're talking about the movement, there's somebody that needs to be applauded. Yep.
When we talk about heroes of the Second Amendment, we have a lady with us tonight that is truly a hero of the Second Amendment. She's been a plaintiff in two or three cases against the city of Chicago, which they lost, by the way. Rhonda Izell, if you would stand up, we appreciate you. Okay. During one of the cases that we were dealing with Rhonda was a plaintiff, I was in being deposed by the Chicago attorney. And there's you know, every once in a while you have some funny things happen. A lot of this is hard work. You got to think about things, and you walk on a tightrope. But the attorney says off the record, he says, you know, we don't think the Second Amendment applies to cities like Chicago. I said, I guess we're going to see, aren't we? And we did. So, Rhonda, thank you so much. One of the things that the Illinois State Rifle Association does is we have a lot of attorneys around the state. We take on cases. And, you know, we've had City of Rockford change their laws, Peoria change their laws. But about last week, I'm sitting in my office, and Mary, one of the gals out front, comes in. A man had called because his son had gotten into a problem, which was clearly not a problem. What he was doing was legal. And the attorney called, and his attorney called and wanted some advice. And so Mary said, well, your plaintiff, or your defendant has already called us, and we have referred it up to our attorney, which is Mr. David Siegel. He says you've already talked to him, and you've already referred it to your attorney and all your 50-some attorneys. He said, yes. He said, let me get back to you. I think this is probably going to go away pretty quick. So that's what it takes. You have to be tough, you have to have the money to do it, and you have to fight constantly. And so that's what we're all about, and that's what you're all about. We're so glad you're here, and thank you.
You guys can enjoy your meal now, and in a little bit we'll be walking around selling more raffle tickets, and then Gresham will be taking care of it back there. And I want to thank Mike over here. He's our sound system guy, and it's fantastic. Thank you.